Hello everyone, welcome back to Insomnia Protocol. Tonight, we have another terrifying horror story for you. Before we start, please subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a comment below. Now, get ready, and let's dive in. I never planned on working nights. It wasn't something I had always wanted to do. It was simply the first job that paid enough to keep me afloat after my landlord raised my rent for the second time in less than a year. The overnight shift paid $3 more an hour than the daytime schedule, and at that point $3 felt like the difference between paying my bills on time and spending another month worrying about overdraft fees. I wasn't looking for a career. I just needed something steady until I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life. The warehouse sat a few miles outside Cedar Falls, Iowa. You could drive past it during the day without giving it a second look. It was another gray industrial building surrounded by loading docks, chain-link fencing, and acres of flat farmland. Tractor trailers came and went all day long, and the parking lot filled with employee cars before sunrise. At night, everything changed. The traffic disappeared. The fields became nothing more than black shapes beyond the security lights, and the highway nearby grew so quiet that you could hear individual trucks long before they reached the entrance. My shift started at 10:45 every night and ended a little after 7 in the morning. Before work, I always stopped at the same gas station a few exits away. The cashier eventually learned my order without asking. Large black coffee, a breakfast sandwich I usually saved until lunch, and a bottle of water. It became part of my routine so quickly that I stopped thinking about it. I liked routines. They made long nights feel shorter. Most of the work was repetitive in the best possible way. I scanned incoming pallets, printed shipping labels, moved inventory with an electric pallet jack, answered the radio whenever receiving needed help, and stayed out of everyone else's way whenever possible. There were usually 6 or 7 people working the warehouse floor during my shift. Nobody talked very much. Most of us wore earbuds even though management technically didn't allow them. Conversations usually lasted no longer than they had to. Someone asked where a pallet belonged. Someone answered. A forklift blocked an aisle for a minute or two. Then everyone went back to doing their own job. I actually preferred it that way. The strange part of this job started before I ever worked my first full shift. Orientation lasted less than an hour. The warehouse supervisor handed me a stack of paperwork that looked exactly like every other hiring packet I had ever received. Tax forms, emergency procedures, safety regulations, equipment checklists. I signed everything without paying much attention until I noticed one extra item sitting underneath the rest. It was a small laminated card. There was no company logo, no department heading, no employee handbook reference. Just a plain white card with several lines of text. The supervisor slid it across the desk toward me without saying anything. I looked down and read the title. Night Shift Guidelines. The card listed 6 rules. If someone called my name from the south loading docks after 2 in the morning, I wasn't supposed to answer. I was never supposed to enter aisle 14 if both overhead lights were off. If the microwave inside the break room displayed 00:01 while nobody was using it, I was supposed to leave immediately. Every trailer seal had to be counted before opening the truck, and if the number somehow changed after looking away, I was expected to report the trailer as damaged and walk away. If security asked where I was over the radio while I was already talking to security, I was supposed to stop responding until someone from security physically found me. The final rule simply told me to finish my shift as normal and never ask questions about any of the others. I smiled before I even finished reading the card. It felt like the kind of prank older employees played on new hires every few months just to see who would believe it. The supervisor didn't smile back. He simply told me to keep the card with me during every shift. I asked if it was supposed to be some kind of joke. He answered that it would be easier if I remembered the rules instead of asking about them. That was the end of the conversation. He called the next new employee into the office, and I slipped the laminated card into my wallet without giving it another thought. At least that was what I told myself. My first week went exactly the way I expected. Trailers arrived. Boxes came in. Boxes went out. The radio crackled every few minutes with routine requests. Forklifts backed up with the same electronic warning sound over and over again. Nothing happened that couldn't be explained. Still, I noticed little things. Nobody ever walked toward the south loading docks alone. Employees checked the lights above ISIL 14 before entering without even thinking about it. One night a man from shipping heated his dinner in the break room microwave. He looked at the display for a second longer than seemed necessary, quietly picked up his food before the timer finished, and left the room without eating another bite. Nobody laughed. Nobody asked what was wrong. Everyone acted like they had seen it before. I convinced myself they were all committed to the same joke. Marcus was assigned to train me during my first couple of weeks. He had worked there longer than almost anyone else. He was somewhere in his 50s, divorced from what I had heard, and accepted every overtime shift management offered him. During lunch, he watched fishing videos on his phone instead of talking to anyone. He didn't strike me as someone who enjoyed practical jokes. While we were wrapping a shipment together, I finally asked whether he had ever broken one of the rules. He kept pulling plastic wrap around the pallet without looking at me. He said he wouldn't recommend it. I asked if the rules were actually serious. He answered that they were rules. I asked why. He tightened the wrap, cut it with his pocket knife, and shrugged. He said he had asked the exact same question during his first week. I asked what answer he had been given. He said he stopped asking. For some reason that bothered me more than any ghost story could have. There was no dramatic pause. No mysterious smile. No attempt to scare me. He simply sounded tired. A few hours later, I was assigned to scan inventory near the south loading docks. Rain tapped against the metal dock doors hard enough to drown out most of the noise from the highway beyond the warehouse fence. The building felt strangely quiet. Even the forklift sounded farther away than usual. I focused on scanning labels one after another until I heard someone say my name. Jason. Just once. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't sound threatening. If anything, it sounded ordinary. Like someone standing only a few feet away trying to get my attention. I instinctively turned toward the loading docks. There was nobody there. I stood still for several seconds, expecting someone to step out from behind a trailer or wave through one of the dock windows. Nothing moved. My first thought was that someone had walked outside. My second thought was the laminated card sitting inside my wallet. The first rule came back to me immediately. If someone called my name from the south loading docks after 2 in the morning, I wasn't supposed to answer. I checked the time on my handheld scanner. It read 20:17 a.m. I almost laughed at myself. I had spent the whole week convincing myself those rules were part of a harmless joke. There had to be another employee nearby. I started to answer before I heard footsteps approaching behind me. Marcus rounded the corner carrying a clipboard. He looked at me. Then he looked toward the dock doors. He asked whether I had answered. I told him I hadn't. He nodded once and said that was good. I asked if someone had been outside. He never even looked toward the doors again. Instead, he told me to help receiving with the next trailer. That was all. No explanation, no curiosity, no attempt to reassure me. The rest of the shift passed without another strange sound. When I got home after sunrise, I emptied everything from my pockets onto the kitchen counter like I always did. My wallet, my keys, the receipt from the gas station, the laminated card. I picked it up for the first time since orientation and slowly read every line again. Everything looked exactly the way I remembered it, except for one detail I couldn't explain. I was almost certain there had only been 5 rules when they first handed it to me. I carried the laminated card with me every night after that, mostly because it fit behind my driver's license, and because throwing it away somehow felt disrespectful. I still didn't believe any of the rules, but I couldn't ignore the fact that everyone else seemed to take them seriously. The strange thing wasn't the card itself. It was how normal everyone acted around it. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody joked about it. Nobody tried to scare the new employees with made-up stories. The rules existed the same way the fire exits or forklift inspections existed. They were simply accepted. That bothered me more than anything written on the card. I spent the next few shifts paying closer attention to the people around me instead of the warehouse itself. Marcus always checked the lights over ISIL 14 before pushing a pallet through it. The shipping crew never crossed the south loading docks alone after 2 in the morning, even when it meant taking a longer route through the building. One of the maintenance workers unplugged the break room microwave every night before starting his rounds and plugged it back in before sunrise without anyone asking him to do it. None of those habits looked forced. They looked practiced, like something people had done for years without thinking about it. I finally stopped convincing myself it was all part of an elaborate joke, because nobody keeps pretending for that long without slipping. The warehouse itself settled into a routine that almost became comforting. The air always smelled faintly of cardboard, diesel fuel, and shrink wrap. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the same steady hum every night. Forklifts drifted between aisles carrying impossible stacks of boxes, while the radios crackled with short conversations that rarely lasted more than a few seconds. Hours passed without anything unusual happening, and I slowly started wondering if I had imagined hearing my name near the docks. Lack of sleep could do strange things to people. Working nights changed the way time felt. Some mornings I drove home without remembering half the trip because my brain was already shutting down. Maybe that voice had been nothing more than exhaustion. That explanation lasted until the inventory audit. Management wanted every trailer seal verified before unloading because a shipment had gone missing the previous month. It wasn't unusual work. I had already checked dozens of trailers before then. Around 3 in the morning, Marcus handed me a clipboard and pointed toward a trailer that had just backed into Dock 9. He told me to verify the seal number before anyone opened the doors. I walked outside beneath the loading canopy while cold wind pushed rain across the pavement. The trailer was still rocking slightly from where the driver had parked it. I leaned closer and read the seal. 478219. I wrote the number on the clipboard. A forklift horn sounded behind me inside the warehouse. I turned my head for maybe 2 seconds. When I looked back at the trailer, the seal read 478289. I frowned and stepped closer. I rubbed my thumb across the numbers, thinking maybe dirt or water had distorted one of the digits. They were clean. I looked down at the clipboard. 478219. I looked back again. 478289. My stomach tightened just enough to make me uncomfortable. There had to be a simple explanation. Maybe I copied it wrong the first time. Maybe I had read the wrong trailer. I walked backward until I could see the dock number painted above the door. Dock 9. The right trailer. I stepped forward again and stared at the seal for nearly a full minute. The numbers stayed exactly where they were. I remembered the 4th rule without meaning to. Count every trailer seal before opening a truck. If the number changes after you look away, report the trailer as damaged and walk away. I hated the fact that I remembered it so quickly. I hated it even more because I actually followed it. Instead of opening the trailer, I returned to Marcus and told him the seal number didn't match. I expected him to laugh or tell me to check again. Instead, he took the clipboard from my hands, crossed out the trailer number, and quietly wrote damaged hold across the page. Then he called the supervisor over the radio and requested another dock assignment. Nobody questioned the decision. Nobody went back to inspect the trailer. About 20 minutes later, I watched through the warehouse window as a different truck hooked onto the trailer and pulled it away without unloading a single box. I asked Marcus where it was going. He said he didn't know. I asked whether anyone would investigate it. He shrugged and told me it wasn't our problem anymore. His answer should have made me feel better, but it didn't. Later that night, I wandered into the break room to refill my coffee. The room was empty except for the humming refrigerator against the wall. I poured fresh coffee into my cup and noticed the microwave sitting on the counter. It wasn't running. Nobody had touched it since dinner break. The display read 12 o'clock like every digital microwave I had ever seen. I looked away while adding sugar to my coffee. Something made me glance back a second later. The display now showed 00:01. I stared at it without moving. The microwave made no sound. The timer wasn't counting down. It simply displayed 1 second, as though someone had stopped time before it could reach 0. My first instinct was to walk over and unplug it. Instead, I remembered the 3rd rule. If the break room microwave shows 00:01 without anyone using it, leave the room immediately. I stood there long enough to convince myself I was overreacting. It was probably an electrical problem, an old appliance, a faulty circuit board. I took 1 step toward it anyway. Before I could take another, someone grabbed my sleeve. Marcus didn't say a word. He simply pulled me into the hallway and shut the break room door behind us. We stood there listening. Neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Finally, I asked whether the microwave was broken. Marcus looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. He said that if I wanted to keep collecting a paycheck, I should stop looking for explanations and start remembering the rules. Then he walked away before I could ask anything else. I finished the rest of the shift without making another mistake, but something had changed. For the first time since taking the job, I wasn't trying to prove the rules were fake anymore. I was trying to figure out how many of them I had already come dangerously close to breaking. I carried the laminated card with me every night after that, mostly because it fit behind my driver's license, and because throwing it away somehow felt disrespectful. I still didn't believe any of the rules, but I couldn't ignore the fact that everyone else seemed to take them seriously. The strange thing wasn't the card itself. It was how normal everyone acted around it. Nobody rolled their eyes. Nobody joked about it. Nobody tried to scare the new employees with made-up stories. The rules existed the same way the fire exits or forklift inspections existed. They were simply accepted. That bothered me more than anything written on the card. I spent the next few shifts paying closer attention to the people around me instead of the warehouse itself. Marcus always checked the lights over aisle 14 before pushing a pallet through it. The shipping crew never crossed the south loading docks alone after 2 in the morning, even when it meant taking a longer route through the building. One of the maintenance workers unplugged the break room microwave every night before starting his rounds and plugged it back in before sunrise without anyone asking him to do it. None of those habits looked forced. They looked practiced, like something people had done for years without thinking about it. I finally stopped convincing myself it was all part of an elaborate joke, because nobody keeps pretending for that long without slipping. The warehouse itself settled into a routine that almost became comforting. The air always smelled faintly of cardboard, diesel fuel, and shrink wrap. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the same steady hum every night. Forklifts drifted between aisles carrying impossible stacks of boxes, while the radios crackled with short conversations that rarely lasted more than a few seconds. Hours passed without anything unusual happening, and I slowly started wondering if I had imagined hearing my name near the docks. Lack of sleep could do strange things to people. Working nights changed the way time felt. Some mornings I drove home without remembering half the trip because my brain was already shutting down. Maybe that voice had been nothing more than exhaustion. That explanation lasted until the inventory audit. Management wanted every trailer seal verified before unloading because a shipment had gone missing the previous month. It wasn't unusual work. I had already checked dozens of trailers before then. Around 3 in the morning, Marcus handed me a clipboard and pointed toward a trailer that had just backed into Dock 9. He told me to verify the seal number before anyone opened the doors. I walked outside beneath the loading canopy while cold wind pushed rain across the pavement. The trailer was still rocking slightly from where the driver had parked it. I leaned closer and read the seal. 478219. I wrote the number on the clipboard. A forklift horn sounded behind me inside the warehouse. I turned my head for maybe 2 seconds. When I looked back at the trailer, the seal read 478289. I frowned and stepped closer. I rubbed my thumb across the numbers, thinking maybe dirt or water had distorted one of the digits. They were clean. I looked down at the clipboard. 478219. I looked back again. 478289. My stomach tightened just enough to make me uncomfortable. There had to be a simple explanation. Maybe I copied it wrong the first time. Maybe I had read the wrong trailer. I walked backward until I could see the dock number painted above the door. Dock 9. The right trailer. I stepped forward again and stared at the seal for nearly a full minute. The numbers stayed exactly where they were. I remembered the 4th rule without meaning to. Count every trailer seal before opening a truck. If the number changes after you look away, report the trailer as damaged and walk away. I hated the fact that I remembered it so quickly. I hated it even more because I actually followed it. Instead of opening the trailer, I returned to Marcus and told him the seal number didn't match. I expected him to laugh or tell me to check again. Instead, he took the clipboard from my hands, crossed out the trailer number, and quietly wrote damaged hold across the page. Then he called the supervisor over the radio and requested another dock assignment. Nobody questioned the decision. Nobody went back to inspect the trailer. About 20 minutes later, I watched through the warehouse window as a different truck hooked onto the trailer and pulled it away without unloading a single box. I asked Marcus where it was going. He said he didn't know. I asked whether anyone would investigate it. He shrugged and told me it wasn't our problem anymore. His answer should have made me feel better, but it didn't. Later that night, I wandered into the break room to refill my coffee. The room was empty except for the humming refrigerator against the wall. I poured fresh coffee into my cup and noticed the microwave sitting on the counter. It wasn't running. Nobody had touched it since dinner break. The display read 12 o'clock like every digital microwave I had ever seen. I looked away while adding sugar to my coffee. Something made me glance back a second later. The display now showed 00:01. I stared at it without moving. The microwave made no sound. The timer wasn't counting down. It simply displayed 1 second, as though someone had stopped time before it could reach 0. My first instinct was to walk over and unplug it. Instead, I remembered the third rule. If the break room microwave shows 00:01 without anyone using it, leave the room immediately. I stood there long enough to convince myself I was overreacting. It was probably an electrical problem, an old appliance, a faulty circuit board. I took one step toward it anyway. Before I could take another, someone grabbed my sleeve. Marcus didn't say a word. He simply pulled me into the hallway and shut the break room door behind us. We stood there listening. Neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Finally, I asked whether the microwave was broken. Marcus looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. He said that if I wanted to keep collecting a paycheck, I should stop looking for explanations and start remembering the rules. Then he walked away before I could ask anything else. I finished the rest of the shift without making another mistake, but something had changed. For the first time since taking the job, I wasn't trying to prove the rules were fake anymore. I was trying to figure out how many of them I had already come dangerously close to breaking. I spent the entire drive home trying to convince myself there had to be an explanation for the date written on the laminated card. Maybe I had simply overlooked it before. Maybe one of the supervisors had written it during orientation while I wasn't paying attention. Neither explanation sounded convincing once I reached my apartment. I emptied my wallet onto the kitchen table and examined the card under the light. The handwriting looked old, almost faded into the plastic, as if it had been there for years. I rubbed my thumb across the numbers until my skin became warm. Nothing came off. I compared the writing to the signatures on my hiring paperwork and immediately ruled that out. Whoever wrote the date was someone I had never met. I checked my phone. Tomorrow matched the date on the card exactly. I stared at it for another minute before putting everything away. I told myself I was becoming paranoid. Working nights had a way of changing how people thought. After enough weeks without normal sleep, small things started feeling much bigger than they really were. That explanation lasted until I arrived at work the following evening. The first thing I noticed was that Marcus looked exhausted. There were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there before, and he drank almost an entire cup of coffee before clocking in. I asked if he was feeling all right. He nodded without looking at me and said he just hadn't slept well. His answer sounded automatic, like he had already repeated it several times. I didn't press the subject. Everyone on night shift looked tired sooner or later. The warehouse felt unusually busy because 2 trailers had arrived late, forcing receiving to reshuffle the unloading schedule. Forklifts moved constantly between aisles while the radios filled with short requests from shipping and inventory control. The noise almost made the building feel normal again. For the first few hours, nothing happened that stood out. I scanned pallets, verified labels, and helped unload trucks until my handheld scanner warned me its battery was running low. I walked toward the charging station near aisle 14 before stopping without thinking. Both overhead lights above the aisle were off. The rest of the warehouse was fully illuminated. Only that single aisle sat beneath a patch of darkness that seemed strangely complete. I looked around for a maintenance worker, assuming someone was replacing the bulbs. There was nobody nearby. I remembered the second rule and turned away. As I started walking back toward receiving, one of the newer employees pushed a pallet jack directly toward aisle 14. I opened my mouth to warn him but stopped myself. Maybe the lights had just flickered. Maybe he knew something I didn't. He reached the entrance of the aisle, slowed for a second, then looked up at the ceiling. Without any visible reaction, he turned the pallet jack around and chose a different route through the warehouse. He never looked surprised. He simply acted as though he had remembered something important. That small moment unsettled me more than I expected. It meant I wasn't the only person changing my behavior because of the rules. Sometime after 2 in the morning, I found myself walking past the supervisor's office. The door stood slightly open, and I heard two managers talking inside. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but one sentence caught my attention. One of them quietly asked whether the replacement list had been updated. The other answered that there was still no reason to make any changes, because everyone had finished their shifts this month. They lowered their voices after that, and I kept walking before either of them noticed me. The words stayed with me for the rest of the night. Replacement list. I couldn't think of any ordinary reason for a warehouse to have something called that. Every workplace kept records of employees, but the way they said it sounded different, almost personal. I kept telling myself they were probably discussing scheduling or overtime coverage. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had something to do with the laminated cards. During lunch, I sat alone in the break room scrolling through my phone while eating a sandwich from the gas station. Nobody else came in for almost 15 minutes. The microwave remained unplugged against the wall exactly as it had been every night since I started paying attention. Eventually, the maintenance worker entered, plugged it into the outlet, checked the display for several seconds, then unplugged it again without heating anything. He noticed me watching and gave a small shrug before leaving the room. He never said a word. I finished eating faster than usual and returned to the warehouse floor. Around 3:30, the rain outside became heavy enough to echo through the metal roof. Visibility beyond the loading docks dropped to almost nothing. Every trailer outside disappeared behind sheets of water. I was helping verify inventory when the building suddenly lost power. Everything went black. Forklifts stopped. Conveyor belts fell silent. Somewhere across the warehouse, someone cursed under their breath. Emergency lights switched on a few seconds later, casting a dim red glow across the floor. Nobody panicked. Everyone simply stopped moving. I looked toward aisle 14 without meaning to. Even under the emergency lighting, it remained darker than everything around it. The shadows inside seemed thicker than they should have been. Before I could look any longer, the main lights flickered back to life. Conversations resumed. Forklifts restarted. Work continued almost immediately as though the outage had never happened. I glanced at Marcus. He was already looking at me. He slowly shook his head once, silently telling me not to ask what I had seen. I didn't. By the end of the shift, I had almost convinced myself nothing important had happened. I clocked out, grabbed my coffee cup from the break room, and walked toward the employee parking lot. As I reached my car, I noticed something tucked beneath the windshield wiper. It wasn't a parking ticket or an advertisement. It was another laminated card identical to the one already sitting inside my wallet. I looked around the nearly empty parking lot expecting to see someone playing a joke. There was nobody. I picked up the card and turned it over. The front contained the same 6 rules I already knew by heart. The back had only one sentence printed in small black letters. If you have received a second card, do not lose sight of the first one. I stood beside my car for almost a full minute with one laminated card in my hand, and the other still inside my wallet. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few pickups that belonged to employees working overtime. The sunrise had started to brighten the horizon behind the warehouse, making the building look smaller than it ever did at night. I looked around one last time, hoping to catch someone watching me or laughing from a distance. But the lot was silent. I compared the 2 cards as soon as I got home. They looked identical in every possible way. The plastic had the same scratches around the edges. The text was printed with the same font. Even the corners were worn in the same places. If there had been any difference at all, I couldn't find it. I almost threw the second card into the trash before stopping myself. The sentence on the back stayed in my mind. If you have received a second card, do not lose sight of the first one. It didn't say to keep both. It didn't explain why. It only warned me about the first card. Instead of throwing either one away, I slipped the new card into a kitchen drawer and put the original back inside my wallet. For the rest of the day, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself replaying the same moments from the warehouse. The voice calling my name. The trailer seal changing numbers. The microwave frozen at 1 second. The strange date written in faded ink. None of it made sense on its own. But together they formed a pattern that refused to leave my thoughts. I arrived at work earlier than usual that evening. Marcus was already standing outside the employee entrance finishing a cigarette. I had never seen him smoke before. He looked at me as I walked across the parking lot and immediately noticed something was bothering me. I almost told him about the second card. At the last second, I decided against it. If everyone else already knew about these rules, then either he already understood what the second card meant or he wouldn't answer honestly. Neither possibility seemed useful. We clocked in and started unloading a shipment that had arrived from Kansas City. Everything felt ordinary for the first couple of hours. I caught myself relaxing enough to think maybe the previous week had simply been a string of strange coincidences. Then I reached into my pocket for my scanner and realized my wallet wasn't there. I stopped walking. I checked every pocket twice before remembering I had left the wallet on my kitchen counter after comparing the cards. The realization hit me harder than I expected. The first card was still inside it. I considered driving home to get it, but I lived almost 40 minutes away. By the time I returned, my shift would be nearly over. I tried telling myself it didn't matter. It was only a laminated card. Nothing more. Still, I couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that I had already made a mistake. About an hour later, Ellis approached me near receiving. He didn't greet me. He simply asked whether I had forgotten something at home. I asked what he meant. He studied my face for a moment before saying that I looked different tonight. I forced a laugh and said I had forgotten my wallet. His expression changed almost immediately. He asked whether the card had been inside it. I didn't answer right away. Somehow he already knew. After a few seconds, I admitted that it was. Ellis closed his eyes briefly as though trying to decide what to say next. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. He told me to stay where other people could see me for the rest of the shift. Before I could ask why, he walked away without another word. I watched him disappear around the corner, feeling more confused than before. I spent the next hour working near the busiest part of the warehouse, exactly as he had suggested. Dozens of employees moved between forklifts and conveyor belts. If something strange happened here, surely someone else would notice. Shortly after 2 in the morning, the radio on my belt crackled to life. Dispatch requested assistance near the south loading docks. Another employee answered before I could even reach for the microphone. A few seconds later, the same request came through again. This time the voice sounded slightly distorted, almost as if the speaker were standing much farther away. Nobody responded. Then my name came through the radio. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a complete sentence. It was simply my name spoken in the same calm voice I had heard near the loading docks during my first week. I looked around. Nobody else reacted. Forklifts kept moving, conversations continued. It was as though the transmission had only reached my radio. I switched the volume all the way down and clipped it back onto my belt. Less than a minute later, someone touched my shoulder. I turned, expecting to see Marcus. Nobody stood behind me. I spun in a slow circle. Every employee nearby continued working without paying attention to me. My heart began beating faster. I checked the radio again. The speaker was completely silent. Another hand touched my shoulder. This time I stepped away so quickly that I bumped into a stack of empty pallets. Marcus hurried over and asked whether I was all right. I looked behind me again. There was still nobody there. I asked whether he had seen anyone. He frowned and shook his head. Then he asked the one question I had been hoping he wouldn't ask. Where was my card? I admitted I had left it at home. He stared at me for several long seconds before telling me to stay with him until sunrise. I asked whether I was in danger. He didn't answer directly. He only said that the first few hours were usually the easiest. It was the end of the shift that worried him. Those words stayed with me until nearly 7 in the morning. The warehouse slowly emptied as employees clocked out one by one. Marcus insisted we leave together. We stepped into the parking lot just as the sun appeared above the fields. I finally felt myself relax. Whatever had happened during the night was over. I unlocked my car and reached for the door handle. Before I could get inside, Marcus quietly called my name. I turned toward him. He was staring through my driver's side window with an expression I had never seen before. Resting on the passenger seat was my wallet. I was absolutely certain I had left it on my kitchen counter. I unlocked the car without taking my eyes off the wallet. It sat on the passenger seat exactly where I normally tossed it after leaving work, but I knew with complete certainty that I had left it on my kitchen counter before driving to the warehouse. Marcus stayed where he was, watching me instead of the car. I opened the passenger door slowly and reached inside. Nothing felt unusual. The wallet was dry even though it had rained during the night. I opened it immediately. My driver's license was still there. My bank card hadn't moved. The original laminated card rested behind my license exactly where I always kept it. I looked up at Marcus and asked if he had put it there. He shook his head before I even finished the question. He told me to drive home without stopping anywhere, and to come back the next night as if nothing had happened. I asked him how my wallet could have gotten into my car. He looked across the empty parking lot for several seconds before quietly saying that sometimes it was better not to know how certain things happened. Then he climbed into his truck and left. I drove home in complete silence. Every few minutes I reached over and touched the wallet just to make sure it was still there. When I finally walked into my apartment, the kitchen counter was empty. There was no sign that the wallet had ever been there. I searched anyway. I checked every room, every jacket pocket, even the trash can. Nothing. Whatever memory I had of leaving it on the counter felt perfectly clear, yet reality disagreed with me. I slept poorly that afternoon, waking several times from dreams I couldn't remember. Each time I checked my wallet before falling asleep again. The card never changed. There were still 6 rules. The faded date remained in the corner. Nothing looked different. By the time I returned to work, I had decided I was done looking for explanations. Explanations only led to more questions. Following the rules seemed to keep everyone alive, and at that point that was enough for me. The shift began quietly. A cold front had moved through during the day, leaving the air outside unusually clear. For the first time since I started working there, I could see the lights of distant farmhouses beyond the fields. The warehouse felt almost comfortable. People joked while unloading trailers. Someone brought a box of donuts for the break room. Even Marcus looked more relaxed than he had in days. Around midnight, Ellis stopped me near the security office and handed me a fresh radio battery without saying anything. I thanked him and started to leave. He asked whether I still had the card with me. I tapped my wallet through my pocket. He nodded once and told me not to let it leave my possession again. I promised I wouldn't. He hesitated for a moment before adding something he had never said before. He told me that forgetting a rule was usually more dangerous than breaking one. Before I could ask what he meant, another guard called him away. Those words stayed in my mind for the rest of the night. Sometime after 2, I was sent to verify inventory in the oldest section of the warehouse. The shelves there were taller than anywhere else in the building, and the lighting had always been dimmer because several fixtures needed replacement. I worked alone for nearly 20 minutes without seeing another employee. The silence felt heavier than usual. Even the forklifts sounded distant. I scanned another pallet and noticed a handwritten inventory tag hanging from the rack. The tag listed a product number that no longer existed in our system. I scanned it anyway. My handheld displayed no record found. I shrugged and reached up to remove the tag. Before I could touch it, I heard footsteps somewhere behind the shelving. They weren't hurried. They sounded slow and steady, matching the pace of someone casually walking through the aisle. I assumed it was another employee until I realized I couldn't hear the sound of a pallet jack or forklift, just footsteps. I stepped into the cross aisle expecting to see someone. Nobody was there. The footsteps continued anyway. I couldn't tell where they were coming from. They echoed strangely between the racks, sometimes sounding close enough to touch and other times impossibly far away. I stood completely still. After several seconds, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed felt almost louder. I waited another minute before returning to work. When I looked back at the handwritten tag, it was gone. I searched the floor thinking it had fallen. There was nothing there. My radio crackled. Dispatch asked for a routine inventory update. I answered without hesitation. The reply came back immediately. Then another voice spoke over the same channel. It calmly repeated my employee number instead of my name. Nobody at the warehouse ever addressed people by employee number. I froze with my thumb resting on the transmit button. The voice repeated the number again, slower this time. I remembered Ellis telling me that forgetting a rule could be worse than breaking one. There wasn't any rule about employee numbers, but something told me not to answer. After several seconds, the transmission ended by itself. When I returned to the main floor, I found Marcus talking quietly with Ellis near receiving. They both stopped speaking the moment they saw me. I asked if something had happened. Ellis looked at the scanner in my hand and asked whether I had gone into the old storage section alone. I admitted that I had. He sighed and told me that from now on nobody worked that area by themselves after 2 in the morning. I asked whether that was another rule. He looked genuinely surprised before answering that it wasn't written down because everyone already knew it. Everyone except me. I wanted to ask how many rules existed that weren't on the laminated card, but I already knew I wouldn't get an answer. The rest of the shift passed quietly. As the morning whistle echoed through the warehouse, I finally felt the tension easing from my shoulders. I clocked out, walked across the parking lot, and unlocked my car. Before getting in, I opened my wallet out of habit to make sure the laminated card was still there. It was, but another card had appeared behind it. This one wasn't laminated. It was a thin piece of yellow paper with a single sentence typed across the center. You have learned all 6 rules. The 7th will not be given to you until you need it. I read the yellow note 3 times before I finally folded it and slipped it back into my wallet beside the laminated card. I checked every compartment to make sure nothing else had appeared, then sat in my car for several minutes without starting the engine. I had reached a point where I no longer questioned whether strange things were happening. The only question left was whether they were happening to everyone or only to me. When I got home, I searched the internet for the warehouse, using every combination of words I could think of. I searched the company name together with accidents, disappearances, night shift, employee stories, security incidents, and even the address itself. Almost nothing came up besides ordinary business listings and job postings. There were no rumors, no discussion boards, no local news articles mentioning anything unusual. It was as though the place had never given anyone a reason to talk about it. That silence bothered me more than finding some ridiculous ghost story would have. I slept for only a few hours before waking with the feeling that I had forgotten something important. I reached for my wallet on the nightstand. The yellow note was still there. The sentence hadn't changed. I folded it again and went to work. The atmosphere inside the warehouse felt different before the shift even started. Conversations were shorter. Several employees kept looking toward the supervisor's office, where the door remained closed longer than usual. Marcus arrived 10 minutes late. Something I had never seen before. He looked like he hadn't shaved in days. Ellis passed through receiving carrying a cardboard box filled with old radio batteries. But instead of heading toward security, he disappeared into a hallway I had never noticed before. Nobody seemed interested enough to ask where he was going. Around midnight, the supervisor gathered everyone for a brief meeting. He thanked us for handling the increased workload and reminded us to follow standard safety procedures. The speech lasted less than 2 minutes. Just before dismissing everyone, he paused long enough to add one more sentence. He said that if anyone became separated from the rest of the shift, they should remain where they were until another employee found them. He offered no explanation. Nobody asked for one. Work resumed immediately afterward. I spent most of the night helping shipping prepare trailers for the morning drivers. Every task felt ordinary. Labels matched. Inventory counts were correct. Radios worked normally. For several hours, I almost convinced myself the yellow note had been nothing more than another strange message designed to keep employees nervous. Shortly after 2 in the morning, I was sent to retrieve a pallet from the oldest storage section of the warehouse. This time another employee named Ryan came with me. He had worked there for several years but rarely spoke to anyone. We pushed our pallet jacks between the tall shelves without saying much. After locating the correct pallet, I turned to ask him a question. He was gone. I assumed he had stepped into the next aisle until I called his name and heard no answer. I walked to the end of the aisle expecting to see him crossing into another section. There was nobody there. I checked the aisle behind me. Empty. I listened for footsteps, forklift, anything at all. The warehouse had fallen strangely quiet. I reached for my radio and asked if anyone had seen Ryan. Static answered me for several seconds before dispatch finally replied that no employee by that name was assigned to the shift. I repeated the name more carefully. The same answer came back. I stood perfectly still, trying to remember when I had first met him. I could picture his face clearly. I remembered unloading trailers beside him more than once. I remembered seeing him eat lunch in the break room. Yet I couldn't remember a single conversation longer than a few words. I slowly backed out of the aisle and returned to the main warehouse floor. People moved normally around me. Forklifts crossed intersections. Supervisors checked paperwork. I stopped Marcus and asked where Ryan was. He frowned. He asked who I meant. I described him as best I could. Marcus listened without interrupting. When I finished, He quietly said he had never heard that name before. I laughed because I thought he was continuing the joke. He didn't laugh with me. He simply asked whether I still had the yellow note. I nodded. He told me to keep it hidden. Before I could ask why, Ellis appeared from behind a stack of pallets and told both of us to lower our voices. He looked more anxious than I had ever seen him. He asked if I had been alone in the old storage section. I admitted I thought someone had been with me. Ellis exchanged a quick look with Marcus before telling me something neither of them had ever admitted before. He said the warehouse sometimes remembered people differently than the employees did. I asked what that meant. He shook his head and said he had already said too much. The rest of the shift became increasingly difficult to concentrate on. Every unfamiliar face made me wonder whether I had seen that person before, or whether they had simply appeared the way Ryan seemed to have. I started paying attention to employee badges instead of faces, checking names as people walked by. Everyone else appeared normal. Every badge matched the person wearing it. By sunrise, I felt mentally exhausted. I clocked out and walked toward the exit with Marcus a few steps behind me. Just before reaching the employee door, I noticed the framed emergency evacuation map hanging on the wall. I had passed it dozens of times without ever looking closely. This time something caught my attention. Every aisle was labeled exactly as I remembered except for one. Between aisle 14 and the south loading docks was another corridor marked on the map. Aisle 15. I was certain I had never seen it before. I turned around to ask Marcus why it wasn't on the warehouse floor. When I looked back at the map a second later, aisle 15 was gone. I barely slept after seeing aisle 15 disappear from the evacuation map. Every logical explanation I came up with fell apart the moment I replayed it in my head. I knew what I had seen. I also knew Marcus had looked genuinely confused when I asked about it. By the time I drove back to the warehouse the following night, I had already decided it would be my last shift. I didn't care about the extra $3 an hour anymore. I didn't care about finding another job. I just wanted to finish one more night, collect my paycheck, and leave that place behind for good. I kept the laminated card in my wallet and the yellow note in my front pocket without really thinking about it. They had become part of my routine the same way my coffee and employee badge had. Nobody mentioned the meeting from the previous night. Nobody mentioned aisle 15. Everything looked exactly the way it always had. Trailers rolled into the loading docks. Forklifts crossed the warehouse floor. Radios carried short conversations between departments. If someone had walked into the building for the first time, they would have thought it was the most ordinary warehouse in the state. Around 2 a.m, the lights flickered once. Nobody reacted. A few minutes later, they flickered again. This time, Marcus quietly set down the clipboard he was holding and looked toward the south end of the building. Ellis walked out of the security office carrying a flashlight, even though the emergency lights had not come on. Nobody spoke. I felt the yellow note inside my pocket and unfolded it without knowing why. The sentence printed across the middle was gone. In its place was a single new line. If aisle 15 appears, do not follow anyone into it. My hands immediately went cold. Before I could show the note to anyone, every light in the warehouse went out. Complete darkness lasted only a few seconds before the emergency lights switched on. The red glow stretched across the concrete floor, leaving long shadows between the storage racks. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a forklift horn sound once before falling silent. Then I saw it. Between aisle 14 and the south loading docks was another aisle that had never existed before. The sign hanging above it clearly read 15. It looked no different from every other aisle in the building. Same shelving. Same concrete floor. Same overhead lights. The only difference was that I knew it wasn't supposed to be there. I heard footsteps behind me. Marcus called my name in a calm voice and told me to come over. I turned toward him automatically before stopping. Something felt wrong. He was standing near receiving, but the voice hadn't come from that direction. It had come from inside aisle 15. Then Ellis called my name from somewhere behind the shelves. A second later, the supervisor called me from the loading docks. All 3 voices sounded perfectly normal. All 3 wanted me to come toward them. I looked around and saw all 3 men standing in different places at the same time. None of them moved. None of them looked at each other. They only looked at me. I reached into my pocket and unfolded the yellow note again just to make sure I had read it correctly. If aisle 15 appears, do not follow anyone into it. Another voice spoke. This one sounded exactly like mine. It quietly said my name the way someone might get the attention of a friend across the room. I felt my feet begin moving before I realized what I was doing. I took one step toward the entrance of aisle 15, then another. I could see pallets stacked neatly inside. Everything looked completely normal. I was close enough to read the inventory labels on the nearest boxes. One more step, and I would have crossed into the aisle. A hand grabbed the back of my jacket and pulled me hard enough to make me stumble backward. I turned and found the real Marcus standing behind me, breathing heavily. He didn't say anything. He simply pulled me farther away while keeping his eyes fixed on aisle 15. The emergency lights flickered once more. Every voice stopped at the same instant. When the main power returned a second later, aisle 15 was gone. There was only the blank wall that had always separated aisle 14 from the south loading docks. Nobody else on the warehouse floor seemed surprised. Forklifts started moving again. Radios crackled back to life. Work resumed as though the outage had lasted no more than a few seconds. Marcus finally looked at me and quietly asked whether I had crossed the line. I told him I hadn't. He closed his eyes for a moment and nodded. Then he said I could leave whenever I wanted. I never finished the shift. I walked straight to the supervisor's office, handed over my badge, and told him I was quitting effective immediately. He didn't argue. He didn't ask why. He only opened a drawer in his desk, removed my employee file, and slid one final envelope across the desk. Inside was my last paycheck and a blank laminated card with no writing on either side. I asked what it was for. He answered that everyone who left received one. I didn't take it. I left it on his desk and walked out of the building without looking back. That was almost 2 years ago. I found another job within a month and eventually stopped working nights altogether. I sleep better now than I did back then. I rarely think about the warehouse anymore. Every Friday my paycheck arrives exactly as expected from my current employer. Once every few months, though, my bank account shows a second direct deposit from the warehouse in Cedar Falls. It is always the exact amount I would have earned for one overnight shift. The payroll department insists I have not been employed there for years. I believe them. What I don't understand is why the deposits never stop. Last week, I opened my wallet while paying for gas and found the original laminated card tucked behind my driver's license. I know I threw it away on my last night. I know I watched it disappear into the trash beside the employee entrance. I counted the rules before putting it back into my wallet. There were still 7. I folded it shut before I could see if there was an 8th. If you were standing where I was that night, would you have walked into aisle 15, or would you have trusted the rules?